Zach, Sean McDowell.
Hey, how are you?
Good, man. How are you, buddy?
I'm good. Thanks for taking some of your time.
Sure. We're driving in in the middle of nowhere in California, so I can give you a few minutes and hopefully help out.
Okay, thank you. So, I have about 10 questions here, so 15, 20 minutes. Just first, it's like basics, how you got into the field that you did, and then some more general apologetic questions. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so how did you get into the field that you did? How would you say you got where you are now?
I took a class my senior year of college in apologetics with J.P. Moreland, and
Okay.
it's the first time I learned about philosophical apologetics and was just hooked. I was so interested, so fascinated, and decided to do a master's program in that.
Okay.
So that was probably the beginning of my professional interest. I grew up with a father who's an apologist, so I've always kind of had at least somewhat of an interest for most of my life. But that class really put me towards the masters. The masters put me ultimately towards teaching.
Okay, that's awesome. So now I have some more general apologetic questions. Uh, okay, so first, talking about Genesis, do you think there's more than one way to have a biblically faithful Genesis, or is a younger 6 day creation, is that the only option, do you believe?
I think there are unmistakably multiple options to interpret Genesis that
Okay,
are within biblically faithful guidelines.
okay. Can you just name a couple of them?
Sure, you could have the day age view where days are a lengthy period of time. You could have the framework view where Genesis is more of a framework rather than trying to give us a scientific account.
Okay,
Those are two approaches that I think have a history within the church and
okay,
don't take a 24-hour day literal approach.
okay. Thank you. So, in reading Genesis 1, it says vegetation was created on day 3, but light on day 4. So, naturally thinking, you'd need to have light before you have vegetation. So, is this a flaw in the Bible, or is this a God can do anything explanation, do you believe?
Well, I would encourage you to get Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Yes, I
The
read that
recent
book.
Do you have the recent one where there's a chapter in there on biblically faithful approaches to Genesis?
I do. I read that chapter.
Oh, good. Okay, so you've seen the 8 or 10 or 12 options we lay out.
Uh huh.
Um, so this is a problem for people who are concordists, who
Okay.
believe that you should try to match up the biblical record with science.
Okay.
So old earthers and young earthers will both give responses to how there could be some other light, whether it's God's character who offers light later in Revelation,
Okay.
it's God who gives light before the actual sun,
Okay.
or some other kind of light that operates those 3 days, or maybe they'll say it's a miracle. But
Okay.
those who don't hold the concordist view would simply say it's poetic language. We shouldn't read science into it, whether it's young or old. The entire approach is mistaken. And it's not an error. It's only error if you assume that it's trying to give us a scientific account, which it's not.
Okay. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so moving on towards the flood and Noah's flood, I believe that if you talk to a more modern scientist, there's not really I don't know how to say it, there's not really records in the fossil layers of like a mass migration of animals, so to speak. Is there evidence for this, or is there major gaps? Kind of. So I'm sorry if that's a little bit confusing. Kind of what I'm saying is, if there were, if the flood happened, there'd be all the animals are on the ark. So why don't we have like kangaroo fossils from Asia and Africa? Why do we only have kangaroo fossils in Australia? As just a general reference.
Yeah, there's a couple ways to look at this. One way is the flood had to be universal but didn't necessarily have to be global. This is how old earthers will often look at the flood.
Okay.
Is that it had to universally wipe out mankind, but it didn't have to be global over the entire planet to accomplish what God was trying to accomplish if you read the text very carefully.
Okay.
So that's one way. Now, whether you buy it or not, I'm just giving you options.
Okay.
So that's one approach that I think is helpful. Second, I think there's clearly some hyperbole that's taking place in the flood story and the flood account. If you read it when it talks about water going to the mountaintops and beyond, I think there's clearly some kind of hyperbole and exaggeration taking place to make the point about how significant the disaster was.
Okay.
Now, from what I understand, there is some accounts of flood in the Middle East.
Okay. Yeah.
Which would account for a more localized flood rather than a global one. And then you have all these stories around the world, kind of literary accounts of a flood that vary in the details, but trace back to some big flood that wiped out people and mankind started all over.
Okay.
Now, there's a chapter in Genesis when we look at ancient Near East, in Evidence, where we walk through some of the different options.
Okay.
But that's how an old earther would respond. I'm not sure how a young earther would respond. I think that's a pretty significant problem for a young earth view. How you get the animals all over the rest of the world and account for the lack of the fossils that you described. I think you'd have to read a young earth position, maybe Answers in Genesis, and see how they answer it.
Okay, that makes sense. So what you're saying basically is that there could have been hyperbole in the scriptures on the size of the flood, in that so it might have not covered the whole entire earth. Hello?
Shoot. Back. I got a little bad signal here.
Okay, it's all right. I hear you now.
Yeah. Bummer.
Hello?
I'm cutting in and out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, keep going. Sorry.
All right, so my next question is about the first 5 books. I mean, I haven't talked about Genesis, but more like now, like Bible history. So I've heard about an argument that basically says that it's an argument that says that historical figures, well, biblical figures such as Isaac and Jacob and Abraham don't exist because we don't have archaeological evidence for them. So, is that true?
So when it comes to biblical figures, there's a maximalist position and a minimalist position.
Okay.
The minimalist position says we accept nothing in the Old Testament unless there's external archaeological support for it.
Okay.
The maximalist position says, no, we trust it, even if there's not external corroborative support. Well, it's hard to find direct external archaeological support for these events 4,000 years ago when you ask the question, what kind of evidence should we expect for these kind of patriarchs in the way the Bible describes them?
Okay.
So, for me, I think Jesus is the Son of God. I think he's been passed reliably, and he speaks about these figures as if they're historical figures.
Okay.
So, if Jesus is God and we have his word and he describes them, in one sense, that's good enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
But then, when we do go to the archaeological record, what we find is evidence that's at least consistent with a biblical account, but doesn't require it and force it.
Okay.
So things like the cost of a slave for Joseph, 110 pieces of silver, matches up really nicely in what we know independently about the cost of a slave during that time.
Okay.
We have evidence for the gate that is described. I saw it with my own eyes in northern Israel that Abraham would have walked through. Now, we can't prove that he walked through it, but the description matches the archaeological record of the time. So I think, being honest, we can say we have a literary record. We have reason as a whole to trust this literary record. And the archaeological record tells us as a whole that this very well could be true, doesn't rule it out, and offers some support for their existence.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So moving on towards the Exodus, is there any archaeological evidence that would collaborate outside of the Bible for an Exodus, or is this only in the scriptures and in Jesus' sayings?
Well, there is some independent evidence, but with an event like the Exodus, you have to ask what kind of evidence you would expect to find.
Okay.
And there's debate about, in the Hebrew, I was just reading a commentary about how it says like 600,000 from this tribe, etc., went out there. That's based upon an interpretation of the Hebrew that very could be a much less number.
Okay.
So, if so, the amount of archaeological evidence would be a lot less than if it's the huge number that it's often translated into English. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I can't answer that, but that's a very interesting point that oftentimes people skip over.
Okay.
Now, as far as evidence for it, here's two examples you could give for the Exodus. Number one, why would the Israelites invent that the origin of themselves as a people was in slavery?
Okay.
Why would they make this up? It's a very lowly description to come from. Why would they invent it? That seems bizarre and counterintuitive for God's chosen people. So that's one indirect evidence that makes me think, there might really well be something to it. A second piece of evidence is when you look distinctly in the book of Exodus, you find a lot of Egyptian loan words, meaning words that have their roots in the Egyptian language,
Okay.
which would make sense more so than you do with the other biblical books if they had just come out of Egypt and this was written by Moses.
Okay.
So it's hard to find direct archaeological evidence, and I'm not even sure what that would look like, but you find these indirect clues that at least say, gosh, it's plausible, and it's arguably maybe even reasonable.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. I remember reading some of that in evidence, but I just wanted to talk with you to clarify it a little bit more. So, moving on to Joshua, I remember reading in evidence that there's 3 main theories about the conquest. To you, which of those 3 theories seems the most likely given their biblical and archaeological support?
And I got to be honest, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I really don't. You're dealing with an event so long ago. There's so many particulars, competing theories that I'm not an expert on Joshua.
Okay.
I think at this stage, given where scholarship is at, we have to show that there's some positive evidence for the conquest. This is not fictional.
Okay.
We know where it's at. We have reason to date it, roughly the time of the biblical chronology.
Okay.
And there's some clues found in Jericho that match the biblical account.
All right.
But partly what we're trying to do in evidence is just be honest with the data and say there's even Christian scholars and conservative scholars who differ over how to interpret the data because it's just not definitive right now. I mean, okay. and this is disappointing to some people, but the reality is you're dealing with events at least, 3,500 years.
Okay,
and
definitely.
That's the nature of the game. So I don't think archaeology rules out the conquest. Anybody who says that is overstating the evidence. But I think we have to be cautious how we state the evidence because there is some leeway in terms of the chronology, how we understand exactly when it happened, some of the events that took place in Joshua. These events are right now.
Okay, thank you. So I won't hold you up too much longer. I just have a couple questions more about what people would say are the morality of God or just about God himself. A common claim that I've heard from peers my age that don't believe in God is that there is no evidence for God, so you can't prove that God exists. So is there evidence that God exists in your opinion?
yes, I do believe there's evidence God exists, but I wouldn't ever say I can prove there's a God, because the word prove reminds me of, like, in geometry, when you lay out theorem and if you can show step by step, it's
I
like an
hated those.
absolute conclusion.
Yeah, I know
Oh,
what you're
wait, my
talking
wife
about.
is here. She's a math teacher. Don't say you hate geometry. But the word prove seems to indicate beyond any question, 100% certainty. Well, if that's our standard, I don't think we can prove God exists. But what I think we can show is there's certain features of the natural world that we live in that are best explained by there being a mind or an intelligence behind the universe.
Okay.
So things like, and this is in the opening part of evidence, where we talk about a theistic universe.
Mhm.
There's things like the beginning of the universe points towards a cause outside of the universe, a beginner.
Okay.
Things like the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a fine-tuner. Things like the origin of consciousness point towards a cosmic mind or a superior consciousness.
Okay.
Things like the origin of life points towards an author of life.
Okay.
So there's no natural explanation for origin of the universe, fine-tuning, consciousness, origin of life, but all of those fit and make sense if there is a mind outside of space, outside of time, that's personal and powerful.
Okay.
So, not to mention the evidence for Jesus, the evidence for miracles, the evidence for near-death experiences.
Okay.
I think there's a cumulative case from a whole range of different disciplines that point towards there being a mind that best explains certain features of the world. So yes, there is good evidence
Okay.
that God exists.
It's a really awesome thing. So my final question for you about God is, could God be a good God if people go to hell? Like, if people go to hell, wouldn't that make God seem as almost bad, or like he doesn't like some of humanity? So what do you think about that?
Well, there is no doubt that hell is one of the hardest Christian doctrines to fully make sense of.
Mhm.
I don't like the existence of hell, and it bothers me if I think about it too deeply. It really does.
Yeah, definitely.
But here's what I know. There's nobody who's lived who's been better morally than Jesus. In fact, he's the only person who never sinned.
Mhm.
Mother Teresa, whoever you think of as our moral beacons, have all sinned. Jesus is the only one who's perfectly good and never sinned.
Mhm.
So we see through a glass darkly, and our moral compass is marred by sin. Jesus saw with absolute clarity, and Jesus spoke about hell a lot.
Yeah.
He didn't threaten people with it, but he warned people about it.
Mhm.
So if the perfect Son of God, morally holy human being Jesus believed in it, then maybe he sees something about reality that you and I don't fully see.
Okay.
So I'm going with Jesus on this one rather than my own intuitions. Now, the other thing I would say is I don't think God sends anybody to hell. I think C.S. Lewis is right. He says, in the end, there's two kinds of people. Either those whom say to God, thy will be done, or those to whom God says, thy will be done. All who are in hell choose it.
Okay.
And I think he's right. God creates us with free will to be with him, or he gives us the ability to reject his free offer of salvation.
Okay.
And if we reject it, that's the natural place where we go, where God is absent relationally from there.
Okay.
So those are, so much more could be said, but those are a couple points I would bring in on that tough question.
Okay. So I have one final sub question off of that. So where do you think that puts people who didn't hear the gospel? Maybe people that lived in tribes in North America and South America before the Europeans arrived, or just people that have never heard the gospel. Where do you think that puts them?
Well, I think natural revelation, like Romans 1, that creation points towards a creator,
Mm-hmm.
or Romans 2, that our conscience of morality points towards a moral lawgiver. If people reject the general revelation that God has given in nature, God is justified in condemning people on rejecting the knowledge that they have, even if they don't have explicit awareness of the gospel.
Okay.
So if the Bible is right, and I think it is, everybody knows that God exists. Everybody knows there's a creator. Everybody knows there's a cosmic mind, and everybody knows this God is good. But we suppress that truth. We don't follow that truth. We reject that truth because of human nature, because of our own wickedness. So I don't think there's anybody who's never heard, broadly speaking. Now, with that said, I've heard enough stories and I've met people who, humanly speaking, could never have heard about God.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a dream. They have a vision. God shows up to them because he knows their heart and their willingness to respond, and somehow supernaturally brings them the gospel. So I think God looks out throughout the history of the world and knows how people would respond, and if people would respond positively, he would bring the gospel to them.
Okay. All right. I think that's really good. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a safe trip to wherever you're going.
Hey, good to talk to you, Zach. Keep up the good work, buddy.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good day.
You too.